But it's interesting to me that in order for this particular project to kind of have the dialogue that it wants to have about faith, it requires a character who is basically insane. Like what I mean by that, there's something very striking about the Holy Fool and kind of like the context of like Andrei Rublev or Catholic, other the Saint Francis kind of type, is that it's not so much a question of like, are they sane or are they insane? Because it could be somebody who is not, is either like developmentally delayed. In the case of Andrei Rublev, like the Holy Fool character is kind of clearly in that state, or it could be someone who is, very holy in the St. Francis, way. But what's interesting is that the question of rationality and holiness, or in the case of Johannes, it's, he can't fulfill his function as this kind of like grace bearing creature, this grace bearing, he's kind of a sacrament in a way. Like he can't fulfill that function without going insane, without kind of being this contradiction. What was kind of sticking with me, this was the sort of the way in which throughout the whole film, there's this constant tension between kind of just normal dramatic action that's happening, and then there's Johannes coming in to sort of disrupt
wandering
things.
in and sort of like pausing the scene.
Yeah, every time Johannes, and it's very interesting how the film just kind of goes back and forth between these two poles. Mm-hmm. But every time Johannes comes in, it's kind of, at least one reading of it, it is, it's this inbreaking again of, if from a purely rationalist perspective, of the absurd, of the, the completely like inexplicable, but from the Christian perspective of grace, of God kind of coming in and shaking things up. But what's interesting to me is that this is just my take on it. I'm curious to see if you guys agree or disagree with it. I feel like this kind of structure, this kind of framework for having a character who's acting kind of like a sacrament in this way, and it's particularly with the aspect of him being kind of having to be mad, to kind of have that effect. I feel like it's a kind of uniquely Protestant kind of situation, wherein that the world is already so disenchanted and so desacramentalized to begin with, that in order for God to speak, in order for God to actually come into these people's lives and to wake them up, it requires this like extraordinary, particularly rhetorical kind of move. Again, it's about the word, it's about speech, it's about words really. And it's, this is something very, very, and I want to paint with too broadly of a brush here, but there's something very Protestant about this aspect of grace is only coming through kind of words and kind of through, this preaching character who, has lost his sanity. And so in losing his sanity, he presents us with this sort of unsolvable mystery because he's still speaking truth in a way into these people's lives. But part of me thinks that that's the case because all the other avenues of revelation, which come through a normal, apostolic, sacramental kind of existence, through seeing signs basically, in all sorts of areas, are cut off. And so it requires this kind of direct intervention, this direct kind of, cut to the chase in order to...
Well, that's what Flannery O'Connor thought Protestants needed, right?
Is it?
I mean, isn't that her whole thing? Like these Protestants in the Christ-haunted South, and they need crazy things to happen to sort of like wake them up? That's like every one of her stories, right? So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying it's kind of interesting to see. You can see it from her perspective as well, because her characters are mostly Protestants. It's not like she thinks that that's the only thing there is, but that like in that milieu, you need some kind of crazy person or violence to happen or something to sort of shock people into some kind of awareness.
Yeah, no, I've heard that before. I wasn't aware that she was making that critique specifically towards Protestants. I just thought that was her critique in general.
That's kind of why this. It's my impression. I mean, she was talking to modern people in general, but the impression I got, I think she actually said like it's also partially because like this Protestant South, and they need to be spoken to in this particular way, and the character is not so much as the audience of her story, although that as well.
Yeah, I think it is. One could point out, though, that to the degree that he's viewed as insane, like by that same token, he's totally dismissed. So that it's not actually effective. The effective gesture is when he comes back at the end with his wits back and then works this miracle, and it's kind of a big rebuke, but it's not as though the sort of alarming and out there way in which grace is sort of being manifested in this film is actually really received by anybody other than the child, who's simple. So it seems to me like the comment is really just sort of more broadly about the sort of modern rationalist tendency to dismiss anything that's out there that is uncanny.
Or that God couldn't speak to you in some way through an insane person.
Exactly. And so their lack of faith is revealed through this, that the readiness to sort of dismiss him, to label him as crazy, because this is the thing, is that even if he weren't crazy, right? Even if he weren't crazy and he were saying the same things, he would probably also be dismissed just as readily. In fact, he is at the end when he comes back in his wits and says what he does about, have any of you actually thought to pray to ask God to give you this woman back? Now, listen, I would be right there too, saying like, dude, you can't say these kinds of things at a wake. Like, shut up. Like, this is super insensitive and possibly blasphemous. But the fact of the matter is that he is throughout the film exposing a serious lack of faith among people, and then the audience is able to see it a little more clearly too in these other interactions. So when Morton is there's a great scene where Morton is speaking with his daughter-in-law. What's her name? Have we mentioned her name? Inger, yeah. When they're speaking together in the barn after he's kind of definitively said no to the prospect of Anders marrying Anne, the daughter of the tailor. And he has this moment of like despair, really, where he thinks that all of his prayers have come to naught. And Inger says, you have to keep praying, and that you don't know. He attributes it to his lack of faith that his prayers haven't been answered. But she says, you don't know that God can't still answer your prayers, despite that. And that I think he often chooses to work in ways that are more secret and hidden. And so that's the real faith, right? Like that I think that his insanity, Johannes's insanity as a device, helps us to identify the lack of faith in these other instances, where maybe things are a little more gray. I think the reason why I like the film so much is because it speaks so directly to this like spiritual malaise of modernity, of post-Enlightenment rationalism, of this kind of despair of miracles, of the sort of desacralization of everything, and the sort of demystification of the world. I mean, this is something that Tolkien...
You can't just ask God to raise your wife from the dead. Like,
Yeah, right. But like, this is something that Tolkien bemoans in his discussion of fairy stories. And the need to sort of to recapture some of that, to escape the prison of modern reductionist thought, and so so this film's ability to do that in the way that Tolkien describes a fairy story as doing that is, I think, what I responded most to, because the thing that the characters are guilty of, this lack of faith that causes them to dismiss Johannes, is the same lack of faith that I'm guilty of, being a good son of the postmodern age. So I find all of these struggles that the characters are going through, deeply relatable, and then the tension in their response, in their reaction to Johannes is my own.